Y is recorded in front of a live studio audience.
And he does all the local musicians' taxes as well as playing with them,
That is amazing.
right? I'm like, yes,
That is the great, yeah, rock and roll tax, rock and
rock and
roll
roll,
auditor. What is the
I don't know, rock and roll tax guy, but
rock
also,
and roll accountant, I guess.
right, but he's also like a guitar player. And this, like the Satin Peaches were good, like they rock out. So,
Hmm.
um,
Do we talk about Meow Wolf quickly?
no.
So it's a art space in Santa Fe, I guess co-owned by George R. Martin. And there's different ones. There's one in Vegas, there's one somewhere in Texas.
Okay.
And it's got a whole theme. And the one in Santa Fe is this somebody disappeared in this house, and it's
Hmm.
in a warehouse. And you walk into a house built inside this warehouse, and you can go upstairs, you can open up all this stuff. And as you're going around, there are clues for this thing, but there's also this sort of like if you open up the fridge, the whole fridge pulls back, and suddenly there's a mirrored hallway to go down.
Oh Lord.
And it leads you into all these other crazy rooms and interconnecting, and they're all filled with this really cool artwork. And one of the spots it leads you out into is this giant kind of courtyard in, again, in this whole warehouse. And everything you get into and out of everything from going through the house or by going through the fridge or into the fireplace.
Hmm.
It's incredibly difficult to explain. But the other day, I'm looking at Jeff McDonald's Instagram page, and there's this
Hmm.
photo or this video of him like he's up on a high level looking down on this room, and it's decorated all crazy. And he kind of zooms in on them setting up the Melvins drummers, and I suddenly realized like they're playing at Meow Wolf. And I mentioned this to the elder, and he was just like, "Oh my God!" We were both trying to think of another band that would be as good to see there with those two bands.
That's amazing.
Um, but check it out. I guess the Vegas one is designed to look like a supermarket. And then I
Okay.
don't know if you go in through like one of the ice chests or something, but it's one of these just insane. It's really neat. Very trippy, very what do you call it? A lot of black light stuff, but there's like pianos to play, but they're all tuned differently. There's something weird with it, or there's one where there's a bus
Hmm.
that is on its end, and you have to sit down and lie back. And as you look up at the front mirror of the bus, there's a screen there that corresponds to as you're turning the wheel. And it's
Hmm.
just all this stuff just completely sort of twists your mind, where you're just like, I don't know what I'm looking at anymore. It's just really cool, really interesting art.
That's
Um,
awesome.
and then to see the McDonald's in their paint splattered glory seems like be great.
This is Why, with your hosts, Heidi Hedquist and Luke Poling.
So you've written a lot in this area and researched a lot in the history of mourning and death and the way throughout history humans have observed it. What was the deal with the Victorians?
Oh,
It,
they
it
do it
got really
right.
weird really quick.
Yeah, but they just do it great.
Yeah, I mean, it almost seemed natural. I guess, I'm fascinated with death for whatever reason, and the previous books um had dealt a lot with, macabre topics and people collecting macabre objects. And I believe that the reason why I'm collected personally those kind of things is the fear of death for me to have these physical objects around kind of was like a way for me to manifest and control the fear, like because
Hmm.
I could have it all around me. Um, so being steeped kind of in that, um, and then to do a research book because the other books are more documenting other people's and myself's collections, mostly obviously mostly other people's collections. To do a research book, the natural, I guess, if you were to pick an era other than I'm sure real scholars could pick other ones, but the first would be like, I guess maybe Egyptian, and then, Victorian era where there was this um real fascination with it. Um, and then obviously what was interesting was the more I did the research, the book became a lot about it's all about death and how the Victorians approached it and but it became because of the life they were living. That's why death was constantly this pall of death being over them. And of course, Queen Victoria had a lot to do with it in an era where way before mass social, any kind of media, she still was known all around the world. So whatever she kind of did was kind of picked up, at least in Western Europe and in the States. So she did have a big influence, but but a lot of it had to come with also just the way life was so rough. So death was always around the corner. Disease obviously was huge, no antibiotics, and actually a lot of treatments were actually detrimental to you maybe recovering from whatever illness you might have been, plagued with at the time. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. The Victorian era just seemed to be a natural segue into if you wanted to research a culture's response to death and mourning. And like you say, it it became death and obviously and mourning, after, you know, how you're going to react to the death of a loved one or just in general death around you.
One of the things too, I think with Victoria, because she reigned for so long. I
Right.
mean, everyone sort of grew up with her, she
Yeah.
was, and it was an era where things were changing. Like you said, it wasn't an era where everyone, we don't have TV, but things were changing. There were photographs of her, like people could sort of see her, and their love affair was she was so in love with him, and
hmm
people could relate because death and there was a lot of plagues and crap before that, but people were also experimenting with these various medications and the like you talk about in your book, the like the industrial age was coming to be,
Right.
and all this stuff was happening, plus the art and the books, and there was just so much. And your book, first of all, you have the best headlines or titles
Oh, that's
for
nice.
your
Thank you.
chapters ever. It's fantastic, and the pictures and
Yeah.
it's gorgeous. It
Oh,
is
that's nice. Thank you very
such
much.
a
That's the
beautiful book.
publisher. A
Well,
lot of,
you get credit for it.
yeah.
And so you need to take the credit for it. So for our listeners who aren't seeing it yet, it's gorgeous and so fun to see. And I'm a big Pre-Raphaelite fan, so
Mm.
to see, Ophelia floating there,
Oh, that's a
is
great, yeah.
she's so tragic, so
Yeah, that's
perfectly
awesome.
tragic.
And so many, all the books previous to this, they were all and Quattro was very cooperative in this. My books are very visually driven. You know what I mean? So it was important that this book, albeit being a research book, that the imagery had to be at least driving, the text, and captions are super important to me,
Yeah.
so that worked well. Back to your point about a little bit about, when you mentioned photography and stuff, that was something too, because like you say, the industrialization, to, the people were grappling with, is this good? Is this bad? You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like, I was interviewed once by National Geographic on an earlier book, and it's always interesting when like an interview brings something up and you're like, wow, I think I should have known that. I should have been aware of that, and I wasn't.
Hmm.
And she said to me, I see your books and it seems like a lot of the collectors in your books are grappling with science and religion. And I thought, oh wow, that's really true. They collect stuff and it's like, is science really what's driving this, or is it religion? It's so close. And here, in the Victorian area, like, science was, squashing religion, and religion was fighting desperately back, so people lost the real sense of like, so not only physically where I guess they felt under attack from the world, but spiritually they were like, I don't know which way to go with this, so, it was a rough time, it was a rough time. And I guess, we'll look back now and say, oh, this was very rough too. But, there was a lot of stuff that, you know, You didn't when you went into when you go into your bathroom now, you don't think you know, one of your appliances are going to blow up because there's a methane buildup in it. You know what I mean? And that,
Hmm.
Right.
and that even had to be taken in consideration then. I mean, I guess the 70s, if you wore a leisure suit, you could go up on fire, but those like the crinoline fires of those women where, that was a real, it wasn't
Right.
as common. People like to say that, oh, women were burning up all over the place. But even if there was, hundreds of pe women, who actually died? Um, two two very famous people died uh from crinoline fires. It's worth me a second just to bring it up because it was uh two interesting deaths like that. Uh, Oscar Wilde's half sisters burned to
Hmm.
death
Oh,
from their
wow.
crinolines going on fire, and Longfellow's wife died from the injuries from her crinolines catching fire.
Oh,
So
Hmm.
although it wasn't, so that's like to bring up a point of where you know general things that you have to disease, which is still an issue, but maybe not as much. You know. Um, There were odd ways to die. I guess there's odd ways to die now, but they're not as
Well,
exciting,
right.
I guess, as your clothes catching on fire.
Yeah.
but all of that, you're playing a percentage game
Right.
in anything. Are you going to get hit by a car crossing the street? But early on, you talk about two presidential assassinations, Arthur and McKinley, who pretty much were killed by their doctors.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's super interesting because especially yeah, their their uh their wounds were severe but potentially not life-threatening, but constantly going in there to retrieve the bullet or to treat the wound
With
without
bare hands.
with bare hands,
Yes.
and yeah, and no sterilization, and it just kind of exacerbated it to the point where sepsis wound up killing both of them. And you know uh it that was publicized because it was two presidents, but we can imagine that went on constantly. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and when you went into the hospital, it was pretty much, you know, you probably weren't gonna come out. So yeah, there were so many things, and antibiotics didn't come about till 1900s. So, and then there was a lot of pushback from the medical community about sterilization. Did germs even exist? How important was that to, you know, to keeping a patient safe? Even things like, they would sweep the bodily fluids. They would sawdust on the floor. You would sweep all the bodily fluids onto that. And then you would throw it outside into the backyard, and people lived right next door to that. So it was just,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, biohazard right there, and
Yeah.
kids running around playing in sawdust. So you know, and, and it's interesting too because I wonder, um, I guess someone could have and maybe it's done. It wouldn't be fun in my opinion as fun, but maybe there was an aspect of Victorian life that was absolutely beautiful, and you know what I mean, and the happiest time of your life. But I think you'd be hard pressed for the average person, average Victorian, to think that, yeah, this was a pleasant time to grow up, other than being young. And when you're young, any time is fun to
You're
grow
going to
up.
live forever. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, that's one of the interesting things, and that I love about the book is the detail, and it's the mourning side of the process of death. I went to, and I'm gonna mess the name of this, the cemetery in Brooklyn, Green something
yeah,
cemetery.
yeah.
Yes. And I feel like I hadn't seen this before. Obelisks as part of
Hmm.
somebody's grave marker, but with a blanket of mourning almost carved into them as over the top of them. And one of the things I love about cemeteries, especially from that era, is the attention to detail and the real work and craftsmanship, putting something together to honor and pay tribute to someone who has died. And can you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
the artwork and the way, so much of it became a public expression of mourning and of loss?
Yeah, that's interesting because what you bring up is the most common imagery people think of, you know, um, like in Gothic time, the skull and the skull and crossbones, that was death. And you used to see them all over the tombstones. Interestingly enough, if in Victorian tombstones, you very rarely see that. The imagery that dominates that are angels, urns, drapery. You had mentioned that, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like, the thing, weeping willow trees, then the obelisk, hands, flowers, most prominently roses, lambs, doves, the open book. Crosses were there, different kinds. There was the cavalry cross and a Celtic cross, handshakes, which a lot of that imagery made its way into tattoo culture also, you know what I mean?
Mm.
So um, uh, angels, of course, and so yeah, so it was more, the lack of a better term or not a very good adjective, beautiful. Um, Representations or pleasant or calming versions of death as opposed to that stark skull and crossbones, which did appear a lot in Gothic times and in Victorian era there isn't much skull or skull stuff except for, interestingly enough, and the reason why I'll bring it up is because it kind of wraps up there. Skeleton in if you're familiar with the Oddfellows, like it's a fraternity, right? So the
Hmm.
Oddfellows had the skeleton. Most, the better, not the better, I guess the more prestigious ones are the ones that had money, had a skeleton in their lodge, a real human skeleton. And it's actually where the term hoodwink comes from. You would wear these things, they were called hoodwinks, and they look like leather. They became very popular like when steampunk was around. They looked like, they were leather with lenses, but the hoodwinks had a little flap on them, and they would put the hoodwinks on you, close the thing, you would walk up to the skeleton, you didn't know it, then they would flip it open and you would come face to face with your mortality. It was part of the initiation rite.
Couldn't
Interestingly
there have been
enough,
like a written test?
I'm sorry.
Right.
I would have taken multiple choice or a written
Yeah,
test.
Yeah.
exactly.
The book is a great, almost, it keeps kind of revealing other things and other questions and stories that spin off of it. The other thing that's interesting is uh, the Victorian way of the public mourning, but then also the fact all of the things people did as part of that mourning,
Hmm.
visiting gravestones and having events at someone's gravestone. I know Michael McDowell, the writer,
Hmm.
used to collect apparently it was a thing to take if your child died young,
Hmm.
collect take a picture of the child in their coffin, and he has had a huge collection of these things, um, which now we look at it and just seems incredibly dark. But they seem to sort of tiptoe
Well, you
this line of,
well, you're speaking to something that's my passion of I collect post-mortem Victorian children.
Oh,
That's the images that I collect.
oh my
And
God, your tax
there's
returns must be.
well, the thing with that is, and there's a sad story to me with that, and that is I had amassed a really nice collection, really, and there's two reasons. The main reason why I collect them is, um, to me, it's the most. I don't know why I would want to do this, but to me, I can't walk down the street and if I hear a child crying, it sends me it really bothers me because,
Hmm.
and I know people say, oh, the child's just crying, it's just crying, it's just a child. But to me, I always believe if that's what you're saying, but that child is in the throes of something. He doesn't know better. This is
mhm.
really horrible situation for him, you know? So
Yeah.
that really bothers me, anything to do with children. So I don't know why I'm fixated on capturing these, these things, but I also look at it as like I'm a caretaker to these images. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And so I had this collection. My wife and I had a child, and it kind of spoke. And we had this huge fight. And while Anthony was little, we had this huge fight, and she threw it up in my face, and something to the effect of, um, this is, you know what, maybe we shouldn't put this out there, but I'll tell you,
Yep.
I'll tell,
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
yeah,
We'll cut it. We'll cut
yeah,
it.
and that, and then you collect all these horrible things, and then I was in a rage, not a physical rage. I
Right.
took the collection and I threw it in the garbage.
Oh,
And the thing that hurt me the most was not that I I threw away this collection, but that it was so sacrilegious and it was so disrespectful to those images. You know what I mean? I've presently have built my collection back up again, but yes. So, and once again, I know I roundabout answers to your
Yeah,
question.
we'll get
Well,
there.
yeah. No,
is that,
I get it.
like you said, mentioned earlier, photography just came into existence. Well, at least photography where it could be affordable,
Right.
and stuff
Mm.
like that, and quote unquote, I guess, affordable in terms of who you were. But if you didn't capture that child's image, even though it was post-mortem, there was no record of that child. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Mm.
That's
So
true.
yeah, it was taken, and it also played into the whole culture where it was something to, you wouldn't not embrace death, but it was something to revere, as not revere even, to respect to such a level that documenting it and keeping it for historical, and it wasn't disrespectful. Whereas now we would think like, oh, that's kind of, exploitive to take a picture of someone who's,
You're right, though. It's so different. It's not like you had a million like baby books and
yeah,
family vacations. People didn't necessarily even have like a portrait on the wall. There was probably nothing.
yeah, absolutely. So you would have to, I actually have a photographer friend who shoots a lot of my books, and he is on a registry to this day where, and this has got to be so sad, where he'll get calls from people in, 21st century, whose parents of children who are in the hospital, and they're like, can you please come rush here now and take a photo of my child, in the
Mm.
hospital before he goes or she goes. So yeah, it still goes on, not as much. And there's interesting things about that. You mentioned in the coffin, um, uh, they also, many times, they pose the baby or the child, holding a ball, or
Mhm.
what looked like they were still alive. So yeah, that might be a little odd. And they also posed the child with the siblings, and that was to show that
Mm.
there was still a connection to the siblings, that they
Yeah.
weren't, now
Yeah.
that they're gone. Yeah, but that's, I have a soft spot for Victorian era uh, children's
Yeah.
postmortems. It's an interesting thing too about, and you talk about in the coffin. If you've seen Victorian coffins, not all of them, but some of them, have you noticed, have like a glass where you can see their face?
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Do you know what the reason is for that? The reason is that there was this is usually a lot before pre-embalming. Those coffins, if you open them up, and there's very few that still have them, if you collect coffins that have an ice tray in them. So that body was laying on a thing of ice. So they couldn't have it where you kept opening it or looking at it, because then the ice would literally melt. So it was actually like a practical thing. Keep it closed. You could see the the deceased's face, but still maintain the temperature so that the bodies, would slow down in terms of, its decomposition.
Yeah.
But they're they're fascinating to look at. I mean,
Oh
that you're just
yeah.
looking at this, isolated part of of a deceased person.
Hmm.
They're also, in terms of coffins, is an interesting thing. If you've ever seen, and they still use the term, but I think it originated in cowboy times. If you see uh, uh, bandits or whatever, or have you ever seen them standing up in a coffin, and then they're in the coffin,
Hmm.
so those
Yeah.
coffins are called toe pinchers, because they had to like cross they were so narrow to save space, that they would keep their feet actually had to be touching, so they would call them toe pinchers. And that leads into other things about, we do go into the whole grave robbing situation,
Yeah.
where the the grave, another interesting thing I find it, when you seal up a coffin, they thought that would um, preserve, but it actually doesn't. It's actually the exact opposite. If you airtight a coffin, it accelerates your decomposition. So, but they sealed them shut so that it would deter them from robbing the grave. And
Mhm.
I always thought before doing the research in this, when you think of robbing a grave, and I just mentioned, someone mentioned you should say, the grave robbing was somewhat to steal, potentially jewelry and stuff, but the medical trade was your big client. You know what I mean? They needed bodies for anatomy classes and stuff. But they didn't dig up the grave. What they would do is they would just go to the top of the grave, smash where the head is, dig out that like 2 feet, and then slide the body out. So they didn't have to really dig up the whole grave, and they did that really not just for expediency, but it was much easier to disguise that you robbed a grave when you only had to put together that 2 feet of dirt and grass, as
Yeah.
opposed to the whole grave. And a cheap way or inexpensive way that relatives would um, try to protect their loved ones from being robbed from the graves, they would strap or tie the body into the grave so that when they put the noose or whatever around the top of the body to yank it out, it would rip the head off. So now the cadaver is useless,
Yeah.
because
Who's laughing now?
Mhm.
because they need the whole thing, so it was a cheap way to, it was kind of grisly, but it was a cheap way to kind of protect your loved one from, winding up on some autopsy table. And as many things, I don't want to be political, but there was a disproportionate amount of African Americans who were the ones that were being grave robbed, and that was because the cemeteries were segregated, and they weren't patrolled as much and stuff, so it
Mm,
was easier for them to access African American graves or slave graves as opposed to or people that might
yeah.
have had more money. I'm
One.
sure the
Yeah.
paupers were, and we all know, I assume, I don't assume that, the paupers' graves, they were,
Yeah.
up for the
Regardless of
grabs.
race, and
Right.
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
you might as well have just taken the body from, wherever and just brought it right to the anatomy place. You know what I mean?
Beyond the Veil, The Victorian Obsession with Death and Mourning by Paul Gambino is available right now wherever you get your books. And for more information, you can find Paul online where he is at collectingthemacabre.com.
Nigel, is that you? Are you here, Nigel?